Hello, my name is Nick McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Programming at NewFest. And thank you for joining us for this conversation around HBO Max's Equal, a docuseries that we're super excited to be screening at this year's NewFest and hosting this conversation, which is an intergenerational celebration of LGBTQ icons. I know when I first saw Equal, we knew we had to have it as part of the festival because it takes not just an intergenerational, but an intersectional approach to honoring the rich history and legacy of our community. By sharing stories of folks you may have heard of who have paved the way, but also some unsung pioneers that deserve just as much space and praise. So I'm really excited to have some of the creators and filmmakers and cast today, as well as a really wonderful moderator. So please welcome our special guest moderator, who is the creative director of the Generations Project, as well as a filmmaker who has a film at NewFest as well, Adam Golub.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to moderate this discussion because I am so impressed with Equal. And given what we do, it's just cannot be understated how important the work of this documentary series is. So I'm gonna turn it over to the creatives and ask you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about what your role was in making this documentary series.
Sure. Stephen Kijak here. I am the showrunner and director of episodes 1, 3, and 4. Episode 1, which stars this gentleman over here, Anthony Rapp.
Hello, yeah, I'm Anthony Rapp, and I play Harry Hay, who was one of the early big vocal and visible pioneers who helped co-found the Mattachine Society. And then Theo, you want to go next, or Kimberly? I'm not sure.
Sure. No, Kimberly, you go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Kimberly Reed, and I directed episode 2, which Theo stars in as the inimitable Jack Star. Right, Theo?
I do. Yes, I'm Theo Germaine. I use they, them, and he, him, and I play Jack Star in episode 2, which is a really awesome episode. And Jack Star was this total badass who I didn't know about him, and this show taught me about him. So like I am benefiting from all these things that I didn't know. So it's pretty cool.
Amazing. It's so great to have both people who were involved in directing and people who are occupying and embodying those historical figures to have sort of different sides of the conversation. So the those who will see this Q&A will have already watched hopefully episodes 1 through 3, and it's just this kind of explosive aesthetic tapestry of different elements coming together to create this assemblage of sort of really little known histories, and bringing to the forefront the names of people who were essential in creating the architecture of what we know as the modern gay movement. And what it occurs to me, and a lot of the work that we do, is intergenerational anecdote and firsthand account. And we have amassed an archive of intergenerational stories, a lot of which relate to a lot of the characters that you're talking about. But as I was watching, I thought how every historical telling is actually always an incomplete telling, and that you're forced to omit the incredible majority of the things that are happening around. And so I first wonder if somebody could comment on this selection of the characters, how you came to the conclusion that these were going to be the people that were highlighted, and was it a difficult process to cut certain people out, and what were those debates like within the creative team?
Yeah, well, let me take that one. When this came to me, it was already kind of developed. There were 4 episodes kind of mapped out, and there were characters kind of assigned to each episode. But it hadn't quite gone deep enough. I mean, when we got involved, part of our process was to do a little redevelopment. I've been involved in queer cinema for years. My first shorts and features played at Newfest and at Frameline and all that stuff. So a lot of the names were familiar. The Harry Hayes, and the Mattachine and Daughters of Bleedus, maybe a little more familiar. But we saw it as an opportunity to take each episode, and it was almost more like, who else can we add to the mix? We wanted to create a more diverse palette, and like you say, something more intersectional, intergenerational. And since we have Kim and Theo here, almost especially episode 2 is something that we're really proud of. Having worked with Jenny Olson in San Francisco, old friend of mine, filmmaker, collector of queer film, and a great historian. She herself had collected a lot of photographs of gender nonconforming folks, trans men, if you will. Maybe it's hard to name and identify people of multiple generations ago when we really weren't using these terms. However, her collection was extraordinary, and Jack Starr was kind of her pet project, and was like, this is a story nobody's told, so being able to calibrate it with kind of the top line, sort of historically recognized but maybe underexplored names and stories with really unsung heroes like Jack, that was extraordinary to do. And yeah, challenging. I feel like in a lot of ways, a show, even though it's 4 episodes and there's a lot of history in there, it is a primer. You know what I mean? Once you get through it, there's still like so much to learn and so many different characters to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I was watching, I was thinking an entire 5-part documentary could be made just about Harry Hay and his incredible contributions to the movement over the course of his life. I was wondering, Anthony, if you had known anything about Harry Hay, like what kind of character study did you involve yourself in order to occupy this person?
I was certainly familiar with his name, and I knew the Mattachine Society, but I did learn more about I didn't know about like the manifesto specifically, and I didn't know about the sort of falling out that happened too, and how he was a little bit, pushed to the side. I didn't know any of that stuff. And I don't know that I was aware directly of like what was happening in government. Like that was a piece that the clearing out, or the attempted clearing out of LGBTQ employees, that it was that overt and that public. I didn't know about that. I have this notion that in the past things were a little more quiet or behind closed doors, but it seemed like it was really like a public conversation, which that was really surprising. And then I watched some footage of him, and I mean, whenever you're playing a historical or public figure, if you're not doing like biopic, it's not about team, but it's trying to embody. So that's what I tried to do. This embodied kind of the energy that I felt from him, and the cadence and the sort of approach. He had a very kind of deadpan, laconic way of speaking, and I tried to capture that somewhat. But there was also there's a little bit of an edge of bitterness there too that I think is important to sprinkle in and highlight a little bit of. In those early days, there was a lot of schism, and how do you approach this? I mean, that continued on obviously later in the AIDS crisis between like Queer Nation and ACT UP and GMHC, and like there were all these different people sort of fighting about how you fight these battles. And so there were internal fights as well as external fights. And so I didn't know that was happening in the early days also. That was very illuminating.
Yeah, it was interesting to think about that transition in the Mattachine Society away from revolutionary identity and to the sterilization of the movement in order to engage in acceptability politics, in order to gain traction, political advances. And I think there's an allegory with the way that our community in the 90s and in the early aughts sort of left our trans community behind and satisfied ourselves with small gains, or not small gains, forgive me, not meaningful gains, but sterilized and leaving certain people behind. I wonder if that was on the mind of in some of the creative choices, especially for episode 2, how to, bring forward those sort of dropped stories in the telling of our history.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like kind of what I said earlier. I mean, I'll throw it to Kim to elaborate, because we really did kind of build that together, but Kim really took it and created the world of episode 2. So yeah, do you want to speak a little more to that?
Yeah, sure. It was a great challenge that Stephen brought as showrunner. And one of the things I really appreciated about telling the stories about episode 2, these transgender pioneers, was that we got a chance to celebrate anonymous people. And that is sometimes a contradiction in terms, right? I mean, like you talk about famous people, why? Because they're famous, and that makes them more famous. And that is kind of the situation that's going on with Christine Jorgensen, which is certainly part of episode 2, as she well should have been. But I think in doing so, we're also able to take a look at kind of the flip side of Christine's fame, kind of getting beyond these surface appearances of her, just kind of surprising people because, oh my God, there's a transsexual, which is sort of what she was kind of breaking new ground doing. I learned a lot about Christine, just in the way that she was able to manipulate and deploy her fame in a way that was really ultimately just about educating people, and the key to that was just humanizing herself. And I came away with a lot more respect of for Christine in her ability to do that, because it's just all about humanizing these stories. And in the same way, we were able to take stories that I mean, I don't think anybody's heard Jack Starr's story before this piece, and even hardly known characters like Lucy Hicks Anderson, who's also in the episode. And there's another character who's a narrator of the Compton's cafeteria riots that happened, and giving us a chance to take these people that we may not have heard their stories, but were certainly very instrumental in building this foundation of queer history, especially trans history. I feel like it's important as important to celebrate them as it is to celebrate the people whose stories we may have heard before.
And to add to that, part of the challenge in the development process was even convincing some of the people above us that, Jack Starr had a right to be in this series. Jack, like, wasn't like a Harry Hay who was like writing manifestos, leading organizations. It wasn't like Frank Kameny out there picketing for gay rights. But there's a few characters in the series that just by the fact of their existence and how they behaved in the world and continued to fight the fight to just be themselves, that there's even evidence of that speaks volumes. And I think it's important to add those characters and to continue to, celebrate and research and learn from those people's lives too. Like Theo said, we had never heard of this person until Jenny Olsen pulled out this old black and white photo of Jack having been arrested for I don't know how many, 15th, 20th, 100th time, it was amazing. I mean, really, an absolutely inspirational character. So
how did it feel, Theo, to play an anonymous character in that way?
Actually, the first thing that happened was
the
first thing that happened was because I'm a nerd and I love getting on the internet and trying to find every single possible thing I can find out about something or someone, if I'm interested. I just was like, Jack Starr, okay. And then I got on and I tried to figure out things about him. And the only thing that I could find was actually a person, like a queer person in like a similar time period who could have potentially been a trans feminine person if they were alive today. And so I initially was like, hey, I think maybe I'm not the right kind of trans person to do this because of the information that I was able to find. And then Kim and I ended up getting on the phone and talking about it. And Kim was like, actually, there's a different one. And I was like, oh my God. But it was cool that I had researched a different, person who was basically anonymous, who was who also kind of existed through news clippings and, photographs and things like that. And then it became, you know, something that was like, I was doing the same thing that Jack does, you know, in this episode, which is that he is this like young rebel who doesn't really, you know, give a fuck, and he does what he wants, even though it's the 20s, and he's by himself most of the time, and he is desperate. I think that there's a lot of, you know, stuff in the episode that's like, to me, is about like how it feels, like the visceral feeling when you finally realize as a queer person that you're not alone. And that is something that I don't know if Jack got to experience. And so getting to do that and like represent this person is something that, like, honestly is like deeply emotional for me, because I was like 100 years ago, I know I would have been a fairly similar person to him. Yeah, so it was really cool. And I also was kind of like, how do I do this? Because we just have so little evidence, and it's like, okay, how do I know I would do this if this was me, you know, in the West a long time ago. So it was really cool and really special, and I was nervous about it.
And you did a great job.
Yeah,
you did a great job.
You were so good.
Thank you. That suit was so nice.
Great.
Nice suit I got to wear.
We had the best costume designer. We really created a period feel for our actors through, weirdly enough, through the clothes. Like, there was this just real attention to making everyone feel comfortable and in their skin. And as soon as I got dressed, it was all like, ooh, wow. Like, I feel it. Like, I'm transformed somehow through the period details of the costumes, the sets. Everyone around it attended to it all with such care, you know. And it shows in the performances. I think everyone was able to slip into these beings and just do incredible work.
Thank you.
Yeah, the same thing definitely goes for the sets too. And I would imagine, Theo, that you felt like you were like in Theo's section, he's kind of stuck in this hotel room because he can't leave, and having him stuck in a hotel room that felt very authentic, I think really helped out.
It was really cool.
And I was going to say, Anthony has the opposite problem, having existed in this. We also do very slightly surreal,
the surreal
kind of, you know, background projections, very minimal sets. A little nod to the great Derek Jarman, who really used this limited kind of proscenium arch, really simplistic theatrical kind of settings to create historical moments. But I was interested to hear you about your preparation of, you know, just trying to embody the spirit of Harry Hay, because we weren't doing long scale scenes with other actors. It was very minimal, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I did the voiceover, so I really did listen. I was able to find some interviews that he'd done. They were later in life, but that's I really tried to listen to his cadence as much as anything else, and his approach. It was like a very matter of fact, simple. I mean, it was a little different than some of the stuff I was doing in terms of the manifesto, but it was I was impressed by how frank and open. I wasn't surprised, but it was like how simple and frank and open he was, like just talking very directly. You know, this is a time too, back when those kinds of talk shows or interviews, you could have a real conversation, like an in-depth conversation in these interviews, instead of like these soundbitey, like 2-minute things where you're on, you know, you can't get anything across. So I was the beneficiary of that. But yeah, I mean, you talk about the focused feeling on the set. It was like this little bubble. It was also like right at the beginning of COVID time, so people were understandably, we were all like trying to figure out how do we be careful, and so there was this sense of that as well. But it's just like all hands on deck, focused, limited time. You know, of course, small budget, and just do the work as best you can. And that was it just felt like being very supported in that way to be able to do something. And that also felt nicely unusual, like the approach, this artistic, surreal docu-series approach was really cool to be around, to see. And that there's practical projection while you're filming, that's pretty cool. I think
that's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the first conversations that I had with Stephen as showrunner of this, was just about how to develop a queer visual vocabulary instead of just kind of taking these standard tropes and, reenactments that pretend like you're right there in reality, but to actually give it a bit of a queer twist on things in the same way that Derek Jarman did. So it was a lot of fun working with these projections and these surreal scenes and these these storytelling techniques for history that weren't afraid to show you, kind of break the fourth wall and show you the boundaries of history. It's kind of like what you were talking about, Adam, that very oftentimes, especially with Jack Starr, and the same thing with Harry Hay, is what we had to deal with from the historical record was terribly homophobic and transphobic, and was constantly misgendering people, and was really sensationalizing the fact that, oh my God, here's this queer person. That's the entire story. That's the only news value that a story had, was kind of pointing at someone and saying, look, they're queer. And so to kind of break that down and find the human beings behind those headlines was a real challenge.
I was also very interested and impressed with the narrative balancing act around making historical assertions, because making concrete historical assertions is actually extremely difficult, no matter how much record and research you do. I mean, all historians do is make sort of guesses about the past. So for instance, the Compton riots happened ahead of Stonewall, but are very, very little known. And there's some idea or possible assertion to be made about cis privilege in why that was the narrative that was carried forward, and how transphobia was in fact responsible for wiping the record clean of the Compton riots. So I'm interested to know how much additional value you felt comfortable assigning to historical facts as you were constructing this story, and how much you tried to steer clear of coming to your own conclusions about why certain things are and are not in the records.
Well, you nailed it. I mean, that is specifically why some of these lesser known stories haven't been recorded more. And at the time, I mean, even Stonewall didn't make national news, but there was at least, social movements across the board had expanded to such a degree that there was more awareness of this type of unrest, where Compton's was just like blink and you miss it. I think, and thank God we had Susan Stryker as well as a historical advisor to help, and Jenny, but Susan, who herself has made a very good documentary about the Compton's cafeteria riots. And I always like to get in that, if people are interested in what we've done, almost every single narrative, in our show has a feature length or an hour-long film about it out there somewhere, or multiple things. You can keep digging. Susan Stryker's film Screaming Queens, for example, we stand on the shoulder of Susan's work, that gave you the full story of Compton's within its historical, civic, and social context. So, we were less thinking, I think, in terms of why things were left out. But when we did include things, again, we wanted to keep correct in terms of how we represented them, gave voice to them, and connected them contextually to other events. It was really important for the producers and for us to show how, one thing leads to another, maybe not directly, but, there is this, history does all sort of move in this direction. It's almost like physics, these different things intersect and influence each other, maybe not directly. But Kim, I mean, given the Comptons of it all, do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, and we did the same thing with this story about Lucy Hicks Anderson, and there is some historical record. And when things are undeniable, for example, we quote from the court records of this wonderful speech that Lucy Hicks Anderson gave on the stand when she was outed, basically in her community of Oxnard, California. but by the same token, sort of related to what I was saying earlier about breaking the fourth wall, there's plenty of conjecture that happens with any sort of historical storytelling. And, we weren't there when, Lucy Hicks Anderson visited her childhood home in Waddy, Kentucky. But we depicted it. And, as storytellers, as filmmakers, we just do our best to get as close to that truth as possible, knowing that there is some conjecture involved there. And what I like about the storytelling we were able to do in Equal is that we could also hint in this, in the way we depicted it visually. We could hint at where that conjecture lay and where it was just undeniably part of the historical record.
Mm.
Yeah, it's like conjecture and artifice are kind of two tools we had to use.
Sure.
And we had to compress a lot. We were commissioned to do hour-long episodes. And when you get the notes shorter, faster, you just think, my God, what do we need to do? I mean, especially it's interesting with episode 1, we didn't actually, when we conceived of this, we didn't have a narrator holding everything together. The characters were going to kind of narrate their own stories. But by adding the narrator, it really, well, first of all, Billy Porter just bow down. But we were able to compress a lot, and we had to sort of take pieces of history and revoice them, take interviews, things that like maybe we had read Dale Jennings had said, or ideas that Harry Hay had expounded, and turn them into just kind of transitional nuggets of information, just to kind of speed things along. Like I said, there are feature-length explorations of a lot of these characters. Harry Hay himself, a very complex, controversial character too later in his life. I mean, we might not really want to go there right now, but he did quite a lot to lay some serious foundations for the movement. And then later in life, there's the radical fairies and other stuff. But containing and kind of compressing history comes with its own pitfalls. So, which is why I do always kind of say, I feel like this is a great primer. Please learn more, be inspired and activated to, take the information and do some more of your own learning.
And the other thing that's going on is we're talking about a very dynamic community, right? I mean, one of the challenges we had, particularly with episode 2, is the terminology that trans people have been using to refer to ourselves has been changing. And over the period of this that we're talking about, starting with Jack Starr's story in 1920s and moving on up through the 60s. There are a lot of terms that have changed. There are a lot of, I learned the term hair fairy, which I had never heard, which was hair fairy, which is very commonly used for people to self-describe surrounding the Compton's cafeteria riots. There were the hair fairies were sitting over in that corner, and the drag queens were over there. You base your storytelling on the historical record that you have, and fill in the blanks when you can.
I think we have to bring hair fairies back. It's too cool.
Yeah, that's great.
I was in Scandinavia last year on a vacation, in Stockholm. There was a really cool little historical thing of the kings and queens of Scandinavia, and there was a queen of Scandinavia. I can't remember if it was Norway or Sweden or whatever it was called at the time, hundreds of years ago, who was explicitly talking about gender in language of the time, but like asserting herself as not being a woman, and using it blew my mind that hundreds of years ago that was being spoken about so openly. And I wish I could remember.
Royalty.
Yeah, by royalty.
Oh
and was
God.
like taking on like challenging gender norms and gender issues and dress and everything at the hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So I mean, it's been going on forever.
Oh, there's thousands of years of pre-colonial gender history that this series obviously was not going to. One thing that I thought Billy Porter's voice did really well, and from my vantage point as trying to foster intergenerational dialogues, is be the translator that you were talking about, Kimberly, basically saying, hold on, sit back, you're going to hear some things that are today pretty offensive, but just buckle in and it's okay. Like, things have changed since then, and you can forgive these people for not having the same rhetoric or language to describe even themselves, which is part of how that, you know, all those oppressive forces really worked.
Don't get it twisted.
Yeah, right, exactly. And another thing that I noticed that was really germane to me in the piece was the abundance of army and war and, you know, wartime. Everyone was an XGI. Everyone was discharged from the military. Everyone had a former life involved in the military to some extent or another. And there's some sort of tragic impossibility of telling young queer people just exactly how much these forces were shaping the lives of these people back in ways that we can't even imagine, because we haven't had war or draftism shape our experiences nearly as much. And I wonder what choices were made specifically in thinking of younger queer folks and how they're going to sort of internalize or make sense of a lot of these things that are hard to process, you know.
Right. Well, you know, that was very much part of the mission statement of the show, was to be able to communicate to a younger generation. And a lot of that was achieved, you know, through almost from the top down, more of like on a stylistic level. You know, we wanted it to look cool. We wanted to have a really fresh approach to the storytelling, a slightly anachronistic use of music, which I'll just say we have like 3 awesome trans musicians that have contributed, you know, our theme song, Shia Diamond, to Octo Octa, providing some electronic textures. Laura Jane Grace gave us some awesome background music in and amongst the free crummy library music from the Warner Library. You know what I mean? To make this patchwork of sounds that somehow hint to the era, but also are very now. So it was kind of wrapping it up in a package that would look appealing, and obviously working with amazing actors of multiple generations who themselves have great histories within queer film and TV and all that stuff. But the storytelling itself, yeah, I mean, that wasn't necessarily a consideration. I think what you end up seeing is, again, from going from hours down to 40 minutes, you just have to compress and sort of simplify things to a degree. Part of the challenge was to not simplify them so much that we were doing them a disservice, you know. There was a lot more about the war that I think we could have dug into, which I find fascinating, which I was learning about. You know, we had a voice in episode 1, Pat Bond. There's a whole film right there. She's an incredible character, comedian, actress, was a member of the Daughters of Bilitis. But if you watch the film Word Is Out, which we reference in a few of the episodes, Harry Hay appears in Word Is Out. It's a wonderful documentary from 1977 that, you know, just has gay people telling their stories. Harry is in it. Pat Bond is in it. And she talks a lot about queer life in the war, you know, where, you know, she went into the WACs and she was like, my God, they're all lesbians. This is fabulous. And was overseas, and just like all these gay girls, her lieutenants, or all the higher ups. And then all of a sudden, like the gay purges start. And she married a gay guy in the army to protect protect each other, whereas a lot of the others were dishonorably discharged, humiliated, and their lives totally ruined. Dale Jennings, who along with Harry Hay were the founding members of the Mattachine Society, he skated by and was able to be honorably discharged. But, you know, we had to cut a little tail of, he was overseas, I think, in the Philippines, and him and a fellow soldier fell into a thing. He would only let him express his affections at night, but they had you know, he was having physical relationships with men. The army was very queer during World War II. And it was because, you know, you had gays from all over rural America, finally, like we say, thrust together for the first time in large numbers. And the importance of that can't be overstated. It really was, people found each other for the first time during wartime. And of course, when they come home, that's when you have either they're going to settle in the suburbs, or the queers are going to land in the big cities. You know, that's where, you know, these populations started to explode. So I could go on. It was a fascinating thread. And then, of course, because of the purges that begin, you eventually can draw a line through to the Lavender Scare, which happens in the wake of McCarthyism, which that is what energizes Harry Hay and the Mattachine to band together. The government is starting to come after us. This post-war chill that set in that really solidified this conservatism and attitude about gay people was what prompted a lot of these people to start fighting back.
And there's actually a little twist in this. I don't know if you want to go into this, Theo, but Jack Starr, in addition to being arrested many times for rum running and petty thievery and all sorts of, most of the time just because Jack didn't want to wear a dress. And that was the conditions of Jack's parole at the time, was we'll let you out as long as you wear a dress. And Jack would say, nope, I think I'm going to stay here. But ultimately, toward the end of his life, he was arrested again after like 20 years of silence for not having a draft card. So this whole idea of the extent to which you were enrolled in the military and that was an expectation also became a legal issue as well for people like Jack.
Yeah, I don't know what to add to that, but I just think that it's just so interesting, and that there were so many people that were doing that. It's like there are other, another, like one other of the hundreds of people, who have that kind of people who could have identified as trans today, who have experience in the military from a long time ago. Albert Cashier is another person who is buried very near where I grew up in rural Illinois, and he was another person too who fought in the Civil War and had issues because of people saying that he needed to wear a dress, and he had issues with like I think getting benefits after he had come home from the war, because they were like, you fought, but like you're impersonating someone, and like I just, there's not enough that I know about. Well, when we started talking about queers in the military in World War II, I was like, I don't know anything about that, barely, besides what I know from the Holocaust and what I know of changes that happened very quickly in Germany. So now that makes me just want to go to a new research project. But
there's a lot out there to learn. I mean, I think A Word Is Out, I believe, is getting a reissue. I think you can find it online or something. It's just it just for Pat Bond's story alone about what women in the military dealt with and all of that. It's such an interesting telling. Dale Jennings has stories. Harry Hay wasn't in the military, but what the part of Harry's story that I found fascinating in those years was that he was like actively involved in labor and communism. And we hint at it in the episode 1 that it was kind of cool to be a commie back then. And it was. It was a legitimate alternative. And it really was about labor rights. A lot of these early gay organizations benefited from having been part of communist organizing. Mattachine Society was built on the secret cell structure of the Communist Party to avoid detection. So that in and of itself, I mean, is a fascinating chapter in American history that also people don't necessarily connect the dots between the queer organizations and communist politics. I mean, Lorraine Hansberry in episode 3, very much involved in like Marxist, real leftist, radical leftist politics. And that's kind of more what we know about her. Her lesbianism is something that's only now sort of being talked about and written about. And again, another great film, Sighted Eyes, Feeling Hearts, all about Lorraine. I urge everyone to see that. But there's a lot of parallels and influences there as well. It's really cool.
I saw, throughout, you can see that the gay movement is always aligning itself with whatever is the contemporary movement that's in opposition to the state. So you have McCarthyism, and you have radical communism. Then you move through McCarthyism, and they're sort of allied with what's in response to state violence. And then during the civil rights era, you have a similar alliance being created between the civil rights movement and the gay movement. I wanted to ask a little bit about your address of race in the piece. In episode 1, there's really only one little sidebar where you talk about the one Black member of the Daughters of Bilitis. And a couple of things I wonder about if, in terms of the available archival material around gay experience, is it just harder to find archival material the earlier you go of people of color, gay people of color's experience? And does it become a little bit easier to excavate that archival as you get closer to the civil rights movement and beyond? Or how are you making choices around how to include race in the piece throughout?
Yeah, very good question. Very complicated and important question. That was a big challenge, and it was something in our redevelopment of some of the stories we wanted to really make efforts again to be more inclusive. Like Lorraine Hansberry was not on the original pitch. Jose Sario was not in the original pitch. You know, so in looking at how we and episode 4 was wide open in terms of like voices we decided to, you know, try to include to tell that complex story of Stonewall. But like episode 3, you know, when we looked at it, we thought, well, you know, if we kind of reshape this a little bit, we really can explore that connection between civil rights and gay rights a little more in depth. But yeah, I mean, in episode 1, that part of the challenge again of having a reduced running time and having to cram so much story in, it was all we could do to kind of like hint at the fact, or at least acknowledge that the early gay movements were very white. You know, Ernestine Eckstein was one of the very few African-American women in the movement at the time, and a fascinating character. Again, someone who, you know, would stand to have their own narrative told about them. She was a real radical force and a really important figure. Again, just a lot of characters that for just various reasons we couldn't expand on. But I mean, I don't even know, you know, I actually don't know the answer to that question in terms of the lack or, you know, of archival materials that are available. Given that the focus of that story was what it was, we necessarily didn't do a lot of that work. We had a really short amount of time to develop and move forward. A lot of the effort was put into episode 3 to just go deeper into Bayard Rustin, Lorraine Hansberry, and Jose Saria, you know, to actually, you know, focus on the character and then deepen that research. But I'd be curious to know. I think there's a lot more work to be done in that space, a lot more work. I'm going to forget it now, but there was a photographer, not a photographer, a collector, somebody who, of course, I'm going to have to look it up, but someone who not that long ago researched and compiled, and I believe it's mostly online, just hundreds and hundreds of pictures of African-American men who were gay, photographic evidence of these kind of, you know, sweetheart photographs and just pictures of men together being affectionate. And just, it goes way back to the war and beyond, you know. So even just in a historical record, someone's already laying some groundwork to explore that stuff. It's ephemera, you know, they're unknown people. They're just photographs that they'll find here and there. Lord knows that there are narratives attached to them. But it's work that needs to be done. You know, we very much just dug into episode 3 and tried to expand those stories. But there are more, you know, and I hope we did a good enough job at connecting the dots, but I feel like there's always more we can do and struggle to, you know.
Yeah, as you started out saying, Adam, we tried to take an intersectional approach to telling the story, but we're dealing in large part with an historical record that was not intersectional. But for those same reasons, as Steve was talking about with Lorraine Hansberry and Bayard Rustin, it was very important to include this story in episode 2 of Lucy Hicks Anderson, who really leads that episode as well, telling the stories of a Black person at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had an entire storytelling show that was dedicated to veterans from the Sage Veterans Group. And one of the storytellers told their story about how when they desegregated the military, that was the first opportunity for a lot of gay Black men to go and be free of their situations and find gay communities abroad in Europe and all around the world. Anyway, yes, of course, like such an enormous mass of stories that can't all be told. I was wondering also in terms of so the cross-pollination of these different movements, how did you feel you were able to address making statements like the civil rights movement and the gay movement in these kinds of terms as if they were separate, while still referencing characters like James Baldwin or people who were really holding those intersectional spaces? How was the script writing, essentially? How was the script writing process and sort of maneuvering around historically sticky things in terms of differentiating between the movements?
Right. Well, again, we had the help of some great historical advisors whose advice we really did take on board. It wasn't that difficult. I mean, when you really see, we're relying on a lot of the words and writings of our subjects. And what you see is, I sometimes maybe there's an overemphasis on the connection between the two movements. What we found, there was a lot of inspiration. A lot of people in the early gay movement were very inspired by what they saw in the civil rights struggles. When you get to episode 4, we're 68, 69, post Stonewall, especially when you have the birth of organizations like the Gay Liberation Front, and someone like Martha Shelley, who speaks to that organization, being one of the first that was very intersectional, because like to her, she says it in the episode, she saw the struggles as united. The women's movement, civil rights movement, the gay cause, all of that she thought should be united. You had other groups like the Gay Activists Alliance who wanted to separate themselves out and just deal with gay issues. So, within the organizations themselves, there were decisions made to either align or run parallel, but the inspiration was always there. I mean, what's fascinating about episode 3 and these characters like Bayard Rustin, this is the man who was the driving force behind the March on Washington, openly gay, but didn't really intersect with the gay movement and gay politics until the 80s. And Lorraine Hansberry herself was really only writing about homosexuality in, pseudonymously, writing letters to the latter, stories, exploring her sexuality under pseudonyms. And again, there was, how do we justify Lorraine Hansberry's place in the series? We actually had these conversations and fights about like, no, she belongs. Because while she wasn't active in the gay movement, as a civil rights hero and political radical, the lessons are there to be learned. And she was a queer person. In talking with her estate, and even just like the Lorraine Hansberry Trust themselves and her niece, were able to help us shape the language to be more specific, to be more correct around her own representation and identification. They talk about her sexualities, plural, which is not something we had thought of. Someone may have off the cuff said, oh, her sexuality was a veiled secret. And they went, whoa, no, she didn't employ veils and secrets. She engaged in these ideas, and she engaged in her sexuality intellectually, personally, privately, but it was very active. And, she wouldn't be pinned down. And she died far too young. And I can only imagine where she would have pushed these ideas if she was still with us, So there was a lot of consideration around the syntax, around the way we spoke about the characters and the movements and their positions within them.
Yeah. Well, it seems like we are going to need to wrap up this discussion, unfortunately. Very juicy, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work. Bravo, bravo, bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just invaluable stuff. I am grateful for the work that you've done. So we're going to say goodbye and thank you, and encourage everybody to keep watching New Fest and see all the amazing queer work that is currently circulating. It's very impressive. And there's really a renaissance happening, I think, of queer film and cinema and creative endeavors in general right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Theo.
Thank you.
See you, Kim.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Theo. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Be safe.
Thanks, New Fest.
Thank you, New Fest.